Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today we're going to look at a brand new shoe mount light meter from AstrHori, the XH-2. Back in December I reviewed their AH-M1 meter and I thought it performed really well. Is this new one going to be better? Hang around and find out. So I'm just going to start off by saying how much I appreciate companies that are designing new products to support film photography. 15 years ago, I thought film was pretty much dead, but I'm glad we've been able to come out the other side with a resurrected interest in the craft. Film photography is still sort of a niche market, I think, so I also thank those of you who've been dedicated to preserving this medium. When digital photography began to take over, I think a lot of us just accepted that our craft was evolving into something new and just expected film photography to fade away. I doubt many of us would have predicted a time when digital and film photography would coexist, with each of them falling into their respective places in the world of photography as a whole, and that our adherence to the old analog process would be validated by companies that continue to develop new products that support this process. Which brings us to this. About a year ago, the folks at AstrHori released this tiny light meter, the AH-M1, except the original version was silver. And the benefit of this shoe mount meter over some others was that the actual shoe mount was movable. Because on some rangefinder cameras, notably Leicas and the older Canon ones, the accessory shoe is positioned right next to the shutter speed dial. And any meter that follows this general design shape and has a centrally located shoe is going to get in the way of that dial. So this meter, the AH-M1, came with a small hex key that allowed you to reposition the shoe so that it wouldn't get in the way. Now, this black version came out last fall, and it offered even yet another interesting perk, the ability to age the finish to match our well-worn black body cameras. Yep, with a little bit of sandpaper and elbow grease, you could make this thing look 50 years old. Because under the black paint is actually some brass. I didn't age mine though, call me shallow, but I like things new and fresh. But beyond this rather niche feature, I found that I really like the meter. I did a shoot with it back in December with my Yashica Mat 124G, and I compared the readings of this meter with the readings I get with my Minolta spot meter. They were surprisingly similar, and I don't think that any of them varied to the point that it would cause a major exposure problem. And because it performed so well, I also used this meter again, and just this meter, on another shoot a few weeks later with an old Pentax H2, and it seemed to work really well with only a couple of caveats. Number one, you can set an exposure compensation on it, but once you do that and return to the normal screen, there's no indicator that the exposure compensation has been set. So I think it'd be really easy to forget that you've set it, and then later you'll wonder why the meter seems off. Number two, the control wheel seems kind of fragile and loose. You can rock it back and forth probably more than you should be able to, and it gives the feeling that it wouldn't be too difficult for it to break. But other than that, I think it's a pretty good meter, and the price point of $79 US seems very reasonable. But then a few weeks ago, they reached out to see if I'd be willing to give their brand new meter a spin, and why not? So here it is, the AstrHori XH-2. And as a disclaimer, I'll tell you that I didn't pay for this, but the company didn't encourage me to be anything other than honest in my review. So let's take a look. You'll notice that this brand new one has the black finish, but a new shape. And besides the new shape, I was told that the photometry is more accurate and it's more sensitive than this one. But let's compare the published specs of each of the two, and for the most part, they're identical, and that includes the price. It's still set at $79 US. First off, these are made of metal. They're not 3D printed, so they do have a nice weight. They feel quite solid. It's an averaging meter that has a 2/3 inch OLED display, a built-in lithium battery that charges via USB-C, a 30-degree angle of measurement, a metering range of EV1 to EV22, an aperture range of f1 to f32, a shutter speed range from 32 seconds all the way to 1/8000th of a second, an ISO range of ISO 5 to 6400, and an exposure compensation of plus or minus 3 EV. And those specs are exactly the same as the older meter, except the battery in this new meter has less capacity than the older version. But that also allows for a faster recharging time. The claimed battery life on the old version is about 12 hours of continuous use. The battery life on the new one is 10. Still, that's a lot of continuous metering with a complete recharging time of 30 minutes compared to 40 minutes for the previous one. The 30-degree angle of measurement is about equal to the view of a 70mm lens on a 35mm camera. And I'd say that coverage is good, even when we get more into the wide angle side of things. Just keep in mind that it won't be measuring an area equal to the entire frame. So if your wide angle shot contains a lot of sky, the reduced meter coverage might actually be a benefit. When you get into the telephoto range though, you'll need to be aware that the meter is measuring from a wider area than what the lens is seeing. So there could easily be something outside of that might cause metering issues. So just keep that in mind. Also, even though I was told that the sensitivity has been increased with this new one, the minimum EV response remains unchanged at EV1. So if they mean more sensitive in another way, I'm not sure what that is. If you have any idea, you can let me know in the comments. Now, let's look at the shape. These are almost exactly the same size. The difference is the AH-M1 sits wide when mounted and the XH-2 sits narrow. And because the new one is narrow, the shoe doesn't need to be movable as it was in this one, as it leaves plenty of space on the sides to allow access to shutter dials on a Leica or Canon rangefinder. But look what happens when I mount it on an SLR. When the meter is placed in the accessory shoe, the rear of it protrudes way back beyond the back of the camera, and will almost certainly get in the way of looking through the viewfinder. It's almost as if this thing was engineered completely off camera and was never put on an SLR during the design phase to even check it. If you have a rangefinder where the viewfinder is way over to the side and away from the accessory shoe, this might be a little less problematic. Still, even though it does sort of hit your head when you look through the finder, it doesn't really keep me from seeing the entire frame. This is a Yashica FX2 and is certainly not a high eye point viewfinder. So if at first glance you think, well, that's not going to work, like I did, I don't think it's as bad an issue as it might seem. Now that that's covered, let's talk about its ability as a meter. Here I have my handy Kodak gray card, and I have my spot meter and my incident meter. So let's see how they compare. We're going to do the incident meter first, and I'm going to choose 1/15 of a second as the shutter speed and an ISO of 800. So that's going to give us f8. If we test it with the spot meter, exactly the same, f8. Let's test it with the older AH-M1. Make sure I have the shutter speed set correctly. All right. And this is saying f9, which probably is about the same thing as 8.04 on these other meters. Now for the new meter, f8. So they're all right there in the same neighborhood. So there doesn't seem to be much deviation among any of these, so it does seem to be fairly accurate. Well, whatever we get as a result in here under these conditions is interesting, but what I really need to do is take this out and use it in a real world setting. What I'm going to do is use my Bronica C2 with a left-hand grip because that grip has an accessory shoe. And this kind of setup is going to keep the meter over here and out of the way. And I've got the camera loaded up with Kentmere 100, so let's go take some photos. So I'm out here today and we're going to check the new AstrHori meter. I actually have this mounted on my Bronica C2. I'm using this camera mainly because I've got a hand grip for it, and that's where the cold shoe is, because the camera doesn't have a cold shoe on its own. And that's probably going to work out better because, I mean, see how far this thing sticks out? I think if we mounted this on the pentaprism of a 35, that's just going to get in the way, but we'll look at it later. It's brutally hot out here. And I've got 2 rolls of Kentmere 100 we're going to put through this. So let's get some shots. Now this church is backlit, so this is not the best time of day to shoot this because the whole side that I'm looking at here is in shadow, but We're gonna give it a shot. All right, so it's telling me, the meter, telling me 1/250th of a second at 5.6. Let's go 1/125th at f8. Well, we're off to a good start. Now let's do that one more time. Having trouble with my trigger here. All right, let's find something else. All right, what have we got here? Still saying 1/250 at 5.6. Let's go for some shallow depth of field. So 1/500th at f4. Just trying a couple of different things with some depth of field. With these crosses that were out for Memorial Day. Let's go ahead and check this all again. So now I've got 1/500 at 3.2. Let's go. Let's just get a quick. Before the sun comes back out. So one thing you have to be careful with this setup is that you're using the thumb to hit the meter button. I'm using the forefinger to trip the shutter. And just a second ago, I got confused and hit the forefinger and tripped the shutter when I really meant to just take a meter reading. All right, let's go find some place that's preferably in the shade. All right, I found a place in the shade. This old basketball gold. It's seen better days. See what we can get out of this. So there is some sky in the back, and I don't know how that will influence the meter much. I mean, I'm not getting any sky in the frame, but 1/500th at f2. Well, I don't have f2, so let's go 1/125th of a second at f4. Slightly different angle. Let's check it again. 1/125th at f4.5. I think this will be fine as it is. All right, before we move on to this location, I am going to get this fence here. Utilize some shallow depth of field. All right, well, I hope to anyway. All right, let's read. All right, so it's 1/125th at f4. 25th at f4, that's what I have here. All right, let's make sure we're focused. All right. Slightly different
composition, same exposure. Let's see if I can get it level and plumb here. Got a couple of more, well, I've got one more frame on this roll. And I thought, well, let's just get something with these leaves here before we move on. All right, obviously we still got shallow depth of field. Got 1/125th of a second at 2.8. Got some sunlight patches behind us. Wonder if I can go 60 at f4. Well, we're gonna give it our best shot here. At least maybe one of these leaves will be in focus. Just one. All right, so that's one roll down. Let's change some film and move on to a different spot.
Yeah, I thought I was going to stay out there in that heat and shoot another roll, but then I thought better of it. But I think the meter performed pretty well for that entire roll. The negatives look pretty good and exactly what I would expect from the Kentmere 100. For the first shot of the church, I was shooting pretty much into the light, as well as the shot of the basketball backboard, and they looked fine. The last shot where we have the plant in the foreground and a lot of backlit area in the background seemed fine too. So, long story short, the meter works. But let's get down to brass tacks here. Would I recommend the XH-2? Well, let's look at it compared to the last generation, AH-M1. The build quality is indeed better. The dial doesn't have any play in it and it feels pretty solid. The issue with setting an exposure compensation is still an issue with this new version, because once you set one, there's nothing on the screen to indicate that it's been set, and that is absolutely something that would cause me grief, because I'm going to be the one to forget that it's set. And the next time I go out to use it, and me not remembering, it's probably going to cost me some film. That does seem like something that would make sense to include in an update. It also has less battery capacity, although the claimed 10 hours of continuous use is pretty long, so I don't know if that's really an issue. But my biggest gripe is going to be the fact that when mounted on an SLR, it kind of gets in the way. And it's hard for me to believe that this didn't come up in any design meetings before they sent this out for production. But there are other types of cameras beside 35mm SLRs where this isn't an inconvenience at all. You'll have no problem with it on a TLR like this Yashica because the accessory shoe is over here on the side. And it'll work quite nicely on this Minolta V2 rangefinder because the viewfinder is offset from the accessory shoe. On the other hand, you have last year's version, which works as well on 35mm SLRs as all the other kinds. I mean, if it gets in the way of the shutter dial, just reposition the foot. It even comes with a hex key to do that. But the brand new version doesn't really seem like a complete upgrade. The build quality does seem better in regard to the control dial, but the internals seem exactly the same as the last generation, and that means that the exposure compensation issue is still there and unaddressed. Other than that, I think it would be perfect to have in place of a TLR kit or with specific rangefinder cameras. And if that's what you're shooting with and you need a meter that's not going to break the bank, then this would be great because it does work. And using it on a 35mm SLR is only a slight inconvenience, I think, due to how far it sticks out over the viewfinder, but not really. So if you think that the design will fit perfectly with your type of camera and are interested in picking one of these up, I'll put a link down in the description. And by using that link, yes, it will go toward helping me buy some film, I'll admit. And if you don't want one of these, well, I trust your judgment. And I'll see you next time.